Like, just imagine that and just like,
I came across this guy, litnomad, on YouTube. His name is Tyler. He's a retired hedge fund quant. And I love when people think differently, uniquely, because it gets you thinking in a way that you oftentimes just don't come across. And he reminds me actually of one of my friends that we used to have a lot of conversations like these. And we've actually touched on some of the concepts that he's talking about. And I actually don't agree with a lot of what he says. But I find myself liking the guy a lot because he's like the more insightful version of Gooby and Dooby. Like, do his videos in the forest. Asian guy doing a selfie video in the forest. But there's a lot more substance and nuance to what he's saying. Whereas you can see what I thought of the Gooby and Dooby video oversimplification and you know, the issues I have with that video and my reaction and follow-up reaction, which are both linked in the description. So if you do like this kind of subject matter, this content, by the way, I do much more of this over on my car channel, Jabal on Cars. It's mostly car reviews, but every now and then I do a my take where I ramble about a topic of interest, stuff like this. The reason I'm doing it here on this channel is because we're doing a reaction. It's not just a rambling video. So my net worth is $4 million, but I choose to live in my car.
you're not going to do this if you're not homeless, right? Like, even though there are free EV charging stations, like, you're not going to try to save $10 by, you know, charging your car at this, like, hotel. Like, what are you going to do? Take an Uber back home? Like, are you really going to, like, just sit here for, like, 3 or 4 hours? Like, you know, I'm willing to do that because I'm homeless. Like, this is my home. So, like, this makes sense for me, right? So anyways, the video, right? It's about, I'm worth 4 million. So why do I live in my car? Good question. I'm living on a fixed budget. I retired early, and not to say I'm gonna stay retired early forever. I probably won't. I'm basically in a short early retirement phase, and I think I'm going to just slow travel the world for about 2-3 years.
He reminds me of people like Tim Ferriss that question the norm and using logic and reasoning will, you know, carve out their own path and live by that path. And I very much respect that. I feel like Tyler's the kind of guy. Tyler, if you're watching this, it would be cool to just chat. Like, he's the kind of guy that I've had a lot of conversations with friends. And the cool thing is you don't have to agree with everything. You can disagree, but you have an educated, nuanced discussion, and that's how you both grow. And that's, I really miss that stuff because I feel like when some of my friends were single and we just hung out more, there was more time for that. And then now we're all busy, they got families, and, you know, it just doesn't happen as often. But there is an issue with people that have this skill set. It's a very powerful and useful skill set. Tyler's clearly a very intelligent guy, but you'll see people like Tyler, you'll see people like Alex Hormozy fall into this trap where they will use oversimplifications to create a point and make it seem much more certain or much more simple and much more the logic will be sound, but the only way they are able to get to that endpoint is by making these assumptions that I don't think are actually true. So I'll talk more about that in a second, but I don't want this to be misunderstood that I disagree with everything he says. I think that the way that he thinks is very powerful, but there's nuance here that I want to add.
And then either during that slow travel or after, I'll probably start a startup or join an early stage startup because I do like the risk profile of startups. It makes sense for me. I don't need the money, but if I'm going to work, I would want the potential to be explosive. So I like the risk profile.
So what he's talking about here is asymmetric risk. The risk to him, not necessarily the startup. The risk to him, if the startup doesn't do well and he's making very little money, or I shouldn't say very little, he's making less money than he would at a more established company. But at a startup, he's making less money, taking on more compensation as equity, and hoping for a big payday in the future. So because he already has a big cushion, his personal risk is lower because if nothing amounts to that, he's totally fine by having a net worth of $4 million. And if things go well, then that asymmetric risk profile really works out. And we use this ourselves at Med School Insiders. We talk about expected value. We talk about what is the optimal thing from a risk-benefit perspective, asymmetric risk. So as an example, with med school admissions, most people that are applying to med school apply to 15 to 20 schools. I think last time I checked, the average was like 17.2 or something. And you would say, okay, that seems like a reasonable number. But one method that I find very powerful to think through these situations, and by the way, on test taking, this has saved me. I think one of the reasons I did well on tests is by thinking in this way. Let's talk about extremes. Why not apply to one school? Why not apply to 100 schools? And you then think of, okay, if I apply to one school, the risk is that I don't get into that one school and then I have to reapply next year and I've delayed being a doctor and I have to go through the whole painful process of reapplying again, possibly even retaking the MCAT, etc. And if I apply to 100 schools, well, there's going to be way too many essays to write. I have to pay way more money to apply to those schools. And those are the main downsides. So when you think of that and you use those extremes, no one's applying to one school, no one's applying to 100 schools. People are applying somewhere in the middle. But using the extremes helps to illustrate the upside and downside. So on tests, as an example, if they would say, if I change this variable by 2%, what would happen? I'd say, well, what happens if I change it to 100%? And you use that way of reasoning to go to better understand what is happening. And then you can zoom in and then apply that. Okay, if I changed it by 10,000%, this would happen. Okay, so 2% would be a little bit in that direction, generally speaking. That is a very powerful way to do very well on chemistry and math and physics and those kinds of questions, and even in some biology. What I recommend is that students apply to more schools. Apply to 40 schools. You say, well, that's way too many. Well, why? Because the marginal cost of adding additional schools after the first, they charge you by the number of schools, and the more you apply, the cost changes. Now, if there are too many essays to write, when you start getting secondaries, you can start picking and choosing. But now you're in a position of power where, again, your downside is much lower. Asymmetric risk there. Another way we think about this is with regards to our comprehensive packages at Med School Insiders. So when you're applying to medical school, 40% is your chance of acceptance in a given cycle, just based on population averages. I guess your actual odds are going to go up or down based on multiple factors, but just population level, 40%. With Med School Insiders, it's 96.9%. So then you talk about expected value. Okay, so if our package costs X number of $1,000, let's say it's a $4,000 package, but the expected value, because you're now going to become a doctor 1 year sooner, earn that doctor salary, average doctor salary is $380,000, expected value with the delta between the 40% and the 96.9%, you now actually have expected value of $211,000. So you spend $4,000, but you get expected value of $211,000 back. So it's these kinds of ways of thinking that most people don't approach things in these ways, and they leave a lot of room for improvement on the table.
95% failure rate, 5% chance of becoming worth 8 figures. That's a risk profile that makes sense for me because I don't need the money. And when you're worth $4 million, it doesn't make sense to just work and grind a corporate job so that you're worth $5 million a few years later and $6 million a few years after that.
It's probably not going to take you a few years to go from 4 to 5 million, assuming that's in equities and investments and not like all in bonds, right? So he does talk about, average stock returns if you're in a broad index fund, 8 to 10% per year. 8 to 10% of 4 million, that's $320,000 to $400,000 of increase in net worth per year from investments alone on average, plus whatever you are investing from your income. So it would probably just take you a year or two to get from 4 to 5, and even less time. So getting an additional million takes less and less time as you build your net worth. And the funny thing is, when I was first learning about finances, I must have been in my mid-20s. I was applying to residency because I was like, oh my God, I'm finally going to earn money for the first time, apart from my college and high school jobs. And me hearing $4 million, oh my God, that's insane. But then when you actually get educated, you realize that you aren't, to make that last for the rest of your life, even if it's invested, you spend a small portion of that. In the FIRE movement, they talk about the 4% rule. You can withdraw 4% per year and not run out. That's actually a very misunderstood. We can talk about why the rule should be more like 3%, not 4% in another video, or maybe on the Jabal and Cars channel. I'll cover it there. But yeah, 4 million, 3% of that, $120,000 per year. So that's a good amount to live off of, but it's also not like you're rich, right?
Like that simply doesn't make sense. And I go into this in like previous video, my first video on the channel, but your happiness level plateaus, not just with your income, but with your net worth. It follows a similar concept, right? So if you're worth 4 million, being worth 5 million doesn't change your quality of life at all. Like you're still going to go on the same vacation. You're still going to, eat at the fancy Michelin star restaurant every now and then.
But 4 million to 10 or 20 or 30 is huge, right? And that, if you keep working at a corporate job for several years, then does that make a meaningful difference in your lifestyle? I don't know. Again, you can talk about the whole discussion of happiness plateauing. And in fact, we might actually get to that later in this video.
It's just a matter of like what percentage of your net worth you're spending. Is it 1%? Is it 1.3%? It doesn't matter. So why would you work a miserable job with a dickhead boss? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to work a normal job. Once you're worth around 4 million, you you want to pick a side. You either want to just retire early or you want to join a startup of some sort. But you want to aim for moonshots. You don't want to just grind. Like, if you understand the ratio of money to happiness, just continuing to grind is like the worst decision you can make in that.
Assuming you don't enjoy your work, right? So you're grinding hard, you're taking a big dip in your happiness for very small gains. And those small gains, he's arguing, are not worth it. It's a powerful way of looking at things. It's a different way of looking at things, and I appreciate that.
I'm basically working with a fixed budget of $50,000 to $80,000 a year. When I withdraw 1 to 1.2% of my net worth annually.
I think it's a bit more than that, percentage-wise, but that's you guys may hear that and be like, oh my god, that's still a lot of money. You got to keep in mind, this guy's like, he's driving a Tesla. He's when he was working, he was probably making several six figures, probably like 500K, something like that. So just keep that in mind. And
that should not only guarantee that I never run out of money, but because it's way safer than 4% withdrawal rate that the FIRE people tend to do. But it should also, in fact,
Agreed.
Grow my net worth over time, because the stock market averages 8 to 10% annually. And even if you back out 3% for inflation, that leaves at least 5%.
The average rate of return when you account for inflation is right around 8%. When you don't account for inflation, it's right around 10%.
And I'm only withdrawing 1 to 1.3%, 1.5%.
But yeah, overall, I agree with what he's saying here. His investments will continue to grow even if he's taking out that small portion, because on average, the rate at which the stock market grows, assuming the past results don't indicate future performance and such, but it's safe to say that if he's withdrawing 1 to 1.5%, like, he's going to grow his net worth over time, assuming he's invested intelligently, which he obviously has.
Basically, my net worth should continue to grow over time. But the reason I'm keeping my base level withdrawal kind of low is because I want to stay below the $47,050 and pay 0% taxes on my investments. And
yeah, so that's like 1.25 to 2%, which is still very safe withdrawal rate. So the reason being that once you are just withdrawing from your investments, that's capital gains, and you're not earning an income. So if he doesn't have an income right now, he's only paying taxes on a certain amount of capital gains, and if he keeps it below 47.5, then he doesn't have to pay anything in taxes. So, and he doesn't want to pay the government more for whatever reasons he may have. So that's just like, I get a unique way of thinking about things, which if he withdraws more than that, he will have to pay a little bit of taxes. And if it was me, I'd probably be like, hey, I just want to enjoy my life and not worry about if I'm paying the government an extra $5,000, $10,000 per year or whatever, if I withdraw $80,000 versus $50,000, or again, different priorities. But again, just I love the unique ways of thinking, man. It's so fun and refreshing when you come across people that have a different, intelligent, well thought out approach.
How do I have the most enriching life experiences on that fixed budget? I go into this in my first video again, but by just living within the budget of a person who makes that much. That's literally the worst way to do it. That's a very boring life. And there's no point in living a boring life. You do it by following a concept that I call Bursty Spending, which is the intermittent fasting of spending money.
Great analogy.
You basically, you live on a very low budget so that your base level of satisfaction recalibrates to that budget. And then you, in short bursts, you suddenly spend a lot. And you do this with everything, right? So I live in my car so that my base level expectation for housing is rock bottom. And then one weekend a month, I rent out a baller ass Airbnb so that I can really ride that wave of happiness and unlock new experiences.
Dude, I love that point. And this is something that I remember chatting quite a bit about in 2019. I just moved to Vegas, and me and my buddy were talking about flights. And I was talking about, you can go from economy to first class. I've never flown first class, but just like as a thought exercise, I was like, I get these points from credit cards, which I talk about in other videos. And if I save up points, I can do economy plus business or first. And a lot of people just want to go for the most premium thing, but I think there's value in actually going to economy plus first and do that for a while. Because right now, economy is uncomfortable for me. I'm tall and I don't have much leg room, and I want to read or work on my computer, and then the chair back is right there. So I'm really uncomfortable. But if I go to economy plus, oh man, this is so much bigger, this is so much better. But then you eventually get used to that. And then I would go, after a couple of years, I'd go up to business. And then you'd be like, oh my God, this is so much better than economy plus, and so on and so forth. Now, what he's arguing is rather than just starting at one point and then slowly increase that level, like I'm alluding to, he's saying just keep it low and then just have these big spikes to like really high luxury.
When my brain goes from, being in poverty to being in opulent, lavish wealth.
In before the comments.
But it's not real poverty, and
he's trying to make a point, guys. Let him be.
I do that with lodging, with the housing. That's why I live in my car, and I do that with food. So I'll drink like Soylent every day.
Wouldn't recommend that.
1 day a month or 2 days a month, I'll eat at like a $400 Michelin star meal. And it's sort of like it's like an experience that a normal rich person can't unlock.
Yes.
Because they eat well already. So the delta of happiness from eating well to eating Michelin star well is smaller than the delta of happiness of drinking Soylent for 3 weeks and then eating the best meal that the most celebrated celebrity chef has created. That's a delta that the most privileged people in the world, that's an experience that they can't say they had, but you can have. And that's kind of the concept of bursty spending. And that's a philosophy that I live by.
I love when people think in these unique ways. It's amazing. Tyler, let's get on a call and talk about some stuff. This would be fun. But I don't agree with him here. Here's why. And this is kind of where I want to talk about why Alex Hormozi does the same thing. When you optimize for one variable, happiness, and you focus on just the short term of that, he's saying I do Soylent, I live in my car, and then I have these bursts of happiness because of the delta. The delta from having Soylent and living in the car to then going to a resort, super nice Airbnb, eating Michelin star restaurants is a huge delta, big happiness. Now, the reason I don't fully agree, and I'd love to have this conversation and hear why I might be wrong, is that, first of all, by having Soylent all the time and making that your norm, you're paying long-term a cost for your health. I don't think anyone who is serious and knowledgeable about nutrition, health, wellness would argue that having Soylent day in and day out is good for your health, is optimal in any way. So there is some price that you're paying there, and that can be related to future happiness. And that's not being accounted for here. So is that kind of oversimplification that I think a lot of people that have this very impressive skill, this way of thinking, that they tend to fall into. So the other thing here that I'm curious about is if you're constantly at this baseline and then you spend a weekend or a couple days, maybe 3-4 days in a nice place, and then you go back to your car, you focus on the delta here, going from your car to the nice resort, and it feels amazing. But even after just a couple days, you're going to feel like, oh, this is nice. So then when you go back to your car, that's a big negative delta, right? So maybe I'm wrong. I think that the better way of doing this is like I was alluding to with the flights. You start with something low and you slowly work your way up. Moving to Vegas, I was in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment with a buddy, and I had one of those. I finally had my own bathroom, which is a big deal for me, and I talk about that in other videos. I have an inflammatory bowel disease, and using the bathroom and sharing a bathroom with 2 other adults earlier was very painful, and I hated it. And I was like, I just want my own bathroom. So having my own bathroom there was awesome. I had my own space. It was awesome. I went to IKEA, and I didn't just go on Facebook and get the cheapest shit, but I got like furniture that was, at least it was coordinated. It was all like the same color wood, and like I got a rug, and I learned a little bit about interior design. It still wasn't that great, but it was better than what I was doing before. So you're not going from 0 to 100, but you're just slowly upgrading your life. I'm not going to designer, I'm not going to Restoration Hardware, a super expensive furniture store. I'm going to fucking IKEA, But that happiness, I loved coming back to my place. After I traveled, after I visited, family over the holidays, coming back to my place, I loved it. And then over time, I got used to it. And then I moved into my house. And now I'm like, oh, you know what? I don't just want that $30 Amazon cheap bidet. I want the bidet that has a heated seat and blow dries your butt and even opens and closes the lid for you automatically, but you don't even have to open the lid yourself. So I'm slowly making these upgrades. I'm not living lavish, but I'm slowly making these upgrades to the point where that baseline each time, when I have that delta, I feel happy. I don't think that the size of the delta is as important. I think having a lot of positive deltas is more important. So starting low, let's say you're a resident and you're making $60,000, and then you graduate as an attending, now you're making $380,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. Huge difference. You could just start spending a shit ton more because you have the capacity to do so. Or you can live like a resident for a few more years and like slowly increase your lifestyle. The reason why the latter is optimal is not just mathematically and financially. Obviously, it's better to live like a resident, save, invest, pay down your loans, all those things. But also from a happiness perspective, you go from driving your beat up 15-year-old Honda Accord, Toyota Camry, and now you get a base level Model 3. Okay, so little bump up. And rather than living in a small, studio, now you have a 2-bed, 2-bath, and now you get the nicer bidet or whatever. You make these little jumps and you spread that out over time. I think that's a way to extend the happiness, build the happiness in a way that is sustainable. Because I don't think the delta in short term is a perfect solution, because the delta back down will also suck. But having these little jumps over time, and then as a physician, as your career grows, you're gonna have a higher net worth. You'll probably start making more money, and then you can start upgrading it slowly from there.
So yeah, this idea, right? I apply it to housing, to food. People already apply it to relationships. But I suppose whether you think this makes sense to you, you have to ask yourself, if you could, if the devil were to offer you a deal where you could live like a king for the first like 20 years of your life, and then after that you live like an absolute, like you're in prison, like a slave for the next 20 years, would you take it? And I would say yes to that every time. And yes is actually the correct answer mathematically. It's because you will always have those memories. You've unlocked memories that other people can never have.
But doesn't the delta thing still work against you in that case, because you were living so great and now you're living so terribly, and you will eventually adjust to the new level? But I would prefer to do the opposite direction. Live really low and then live like a king, right?
And these are the sort of things that say like Bernie Madoff or like that Catch Me If You Can guy, scammers, like people who start some kind of Ponzi scheme and then they know the Ponzi scheme's going to implode on them at some point in the future, but they still do it. I think these are things that they've considered, and they just made the calculated decision that this is worth it to them. And I say they're smart for doing it. Just want to be clear, I'm not saying to be unethical. I would never start a Ponzi scheme. That's like really scumbag behavior. I'm saying hypothetically, if you could be in a situation where, for one reason or another, you could live like a king for 20 years and then you have to live like a slave for 20 years, is it worth it? The answer is it is worth it. So I sort of live my life that way. And the devil never made any deal with me, but those deals are self-imposed, right? I have my budget of $50,000 to $80,000 a year, and I'm drinking Soylent every day and living in my car because I'm conditioning my mind. I'm detoxing myself to recalibrate to the base level happiness that comes with the absolute bare minimum.
Tim Ferriss has talked about this, and it was written about by Seneca, I believe, one of the Stoics, where 1 week a quarter, 1 week a year, he would live as if he was impoverished. He would eat beans and rice, and sleep in whatever place, not his regular home, to ward off the entitlement, the comfort, the things that come with constantly living a good life, because you adjust to just about everything, right? Even having a terrible illness, or getting paralyzed, or having amputations or whatever, in the first year you're going to feel terrible, and then you reset your level of satisfaction with life, and you can still have great moments after that. I like the concept, but again, constantly sleeping in your car, your sleep quality is going to be compromised. We know how that influences health. Soylent, nutrition, that's not going to be optimal for your health. These are prices that you are paying long term, and long term, your happiness, I would say, is very, very much deeply rooted in your health and well-being. And going back to Hormozi, right? So Hormozi is a brilliant entrepreneur, makes amazing content. I've read some of his books. I think he has a lot of value. And he has a similar strength to Tyler here, where they can think in these larger complex systems, like how to simplify it. And I remember seeing this Instagram post by him where he said that married men make more than unmarried men. And the reason is that married men have more to lose. They have these people that are depending on them, their wife, their kids, and they have this fire under their butt, therefore, to push hard. Whereas unmarried men don't have that. And therefore, there's some benefit to having people relying on you because it's going to push you harder. And that's not wrong, but it is an oversimplification because that could be part of it. But to say that's the reason, I would argue there's a lot of confounding variables there. And if you understand statistics or you do research, and by the way, we have a whole research course on that, which is how you can, if you are pre-med, how you can get into med school by having a ton of publications. You have to understand, you do a peer review process when you get published. So you need to understand statistics, the validity of your research, the conclusions you can and cannot draw, the limitations, etc. And there I would say, well, first of all, aren't men who have higher income more likely to get married in the first place? Aren't men who have higher income have other factors such as better health or better social skills, or we've even seen the correlation between height and income. Don't those variables also play into whether or not they're married and have kids versus not? You look at, let's talk about extremes here. Let's look at an incel versus someone who is a billionaire, right? You can think about the extremes to think of other reasons why. Is it the family being the lead domino, or is it just a downstream consequence of other things? Another one from Hormozy I want to include here was about how like 80 or 90% of millionaires are totally self-made. You can always find the research that supports your point. I remember coming across one study that was saying 70% of millionaires are not self-made because they used a different method to say that if like 20% or more of your net worth at whatever point was from inheritance or relatives or other things beyond just your own work, then you're not self-made. And I would agree more with that statement, because oftentimes the people who are self-made, they're like, oh yeah, I earned all of it myself. It's like, yeah, but you had your college, med school, whatever paid off. You had the down payment on your home. That's money that you otherwise would have had to spend. And if you take the time value of money, $200,000 when you're 20 years old is worth millions and millions and millions by the time you're 50 or 60. So, and it's not even just the time value of money, which is what is easiest to argue the point. And I think that's already enough to add pause to that point. But what I think is a much more important point is to say it's actually the risk tolerance that you have. When you're younger, you can afford more risk if you don't have these liabilities, these things that are holding you back. First of all, you don't have these things that you need to worry about paying, but more importantly, you are from a family that can serve as your safety net. So you can afford to take higher risk, because if you fail, then guess what? Your family's got you. They can help support you if shit really hit the fan. And that's the bigger thing. Because those who don't have that safety net, it's a completely different equation. They cannot take the same risks that you can. It's not even about the money anymore.
Such that when I ride the wave up to the absolute euphoric peak of whatever sense it may be, whether it's dining, right? That's like taste. That way I can hit the very high watermarks of happiness and unlock those experiences. So that's my thinking behind that. And the question is like, okay, what if I'm worth 8 figures? What if my startup blows up and I'm wildly wealthy? What would I do? I would still do this, but from the lowest lows, my highs would be like insanely high. Instead of just eating a Michelin star restaurant, like it would go crazy, bro. Like I would probably I would probably like supermodel Wagyu steak on a plate on her back.
Oh God.
While listening to like Mozart on surround sound. Like every sense, right? Like eyes, nose, mouth, ears. Every sense would have to pop. It would have to be maximum. And that would be the goal.
Okay, so whatever crazy fantasy you have, why not would you not still get a very large delta by, and actually a better, so if you want to mathematically optimize for happiness long term, to not take as much of a hit on your sleep and your nutrition and your long-term health by at least sleeping in like, a low budget motel, or something that's not going to actually detrimentally affect your sleep so much. Get actual blackout shades in your room and whatever. It doesn't have to be super luxurious, But isn't that a more optimal long-term equation?
Like, just imagine that, and just like, even if I died in that moment, like, I'd probably be okay with it. Like, what an experience, dude, to unlock that. Just, like, that would be insane. And yeah, I'm basically just, I would just do that, and then I would detox from it, live in my car for 2 months, renormalize my base level happiness, get used to that. Let the hedonic treadmill recalibrate me back to that.
Yeah, so the hedonic treadmill is the term that's oftentimes brought up. And my argument is just to ride that hedonic treadmill very, very slowly. And that is, I think, a great way to extend the happiness of the joy. And, when I travel, I come back home and I sleep in my bed with my blackout curtains and I sit on my heated toilet. I'm like, I love this place, right? And maybe at some point, the level of, I love this place is going to die down. And then maybe I don't know what else bidets can do or what else the next thing would be, but I'll just take a small step up from there. Oh, I know what I would do. I'd get one of those like integrated toilets that's not just a bidet that you like screw onto your existing toilet, but my buddy has one where it's like the whole toilet is integrated with the smart thing, and it's just like even more polished and refined and works better and doesn't have the weird creaks and rattles and gotta tighten things and whatever. It's kind of weird that a lot of my happiness and joy seems to focus around toilets.
And then 1 or 2 days again, rent out the most ridiculous Airbnb and and have energy again. That's the way I live my life, and I believe that's the way to live your life if you want to maximize your happiness. So yeah.
Great video, Tyler. Looking forward to seeing more.